Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 21, the whole chapter. And so to kick us off, Jason, do you mind just giving us a quick summary of what occurred here?
So obviously our overarching theme is Elijah. This is a chapter where he hasn't been around for a bit, but now he shows up. And so just watch for that. But anyway, and as always, real quick, just if we'd love for you to read it versus my summary. So taking a break and then reading it and then coming back would be great. But anyway, in summary.
What a fun social experiment to be like, we've made this all up. None of this happens in the Bible. Do you believe this?
Years from now, people are preaching about this. Anyway, so back to Naboth. Are we agreed that Naboth is the way to say that? Naboth?
Yeah,
Naboth?
that sounds good.
Naboth?
I was going to go like Nabu, like
Yeah.
Naboth.
Sure you were. It's a silent TH. So anyway, so he has a vineyard. Ahab wants it. He asks for it. He's really upset. His wife comes along and says, "Why are you so sullen?" Basically, which is a great word. And he stopped eating, and he's like, "I didn't get my way." And so she writes a bunch of letters, and they have this meeting, and basically it leads to him being killed. And then Jezebel tells Ahab, "Hey, it's yours now." Then God goes to Elijah and says, "Hey, here's what's going on." Elijah comes and says to him, "Hey, these bad things are going to happen, and where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours, and not just yours, but your wife's, and basically you're doomed." And so Ahab has a surprising response in terms of anything we've seen to this point. And he repents, he tears his clothes in verse 27 and puts on sackcloth and fasted. God notices and ends the chapter with, "Because he's humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in this day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son." So there you go. Very, very quick overview,
Sure.
Which leads me to ask, Connor, what do you notice about this context that jumps out at you?
So we might have to go back to the very beginning later on, because what is sticking out to me now is the language that Elijah uses, that God seems to give him in terms of what is going to happen to Ahab for all that he's done, is very graphic, like you said. It says this. "This is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, this is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours." What's so staggering to me about that is that's not a "Hey, repent and turn away, or otherwise my wrath will come against you." That's the words of God saying, "You will be punished. My wrath will come down upon you." And there doesn't seem to be a lot of wiggle room here until seemingly Ahab repents and does turn away and acts meekly, and is sorrowful for what he's done, and I don't know, maybe even sorrowful for the potential punishment that he's going to face. And so the fact that then God seems to change his mind, or I don't know if this was always what his plan was, or what. So just what the interaction is between what God initially says is going to happen, King Ahab's response to that, and then God's response to his, I don't know if repentance is the right word, but his sorrowful regret of how he handled things is so, to use an old word, perplexing to me.
It is. Yeah, and this touches on that whole dynamic that I think is always a little bit of a brain buster, in the sense of, okay, so God knows everything. So then does he set these situations up for us to learn, for Elijah to learn, for everybody to learn? If God knows everything, then he would not be surprised. And that would be, I don't think that's a huge inconsistency in this context for
Sure.
God to say, look, I'm going to press on him in this way. I see he's going to respond in this way, and this gives him that opportunity. God is often portrayed in the Old Testament as being mean and harsh and everything, and then Jesus comes along as very gentle and meek. But in the New Testament, Jesus says some very harsh things. In the Old Testament, God clearly demonstrates grace. This is one of those times he does. But then it raises the question of justice. If you are Naboth's kids, you're like, yeah, And then, of course, they're not reading this, but it's like if they have any awareness of this, like, yeah, justice, he needs to die and everybody needs to die. And then it's like, no, he took a few days to say he was sorry. It's like, what? So it's always on earth, it's always going to be unjust for somebody.
Yeah.
Because if I'm the one needing the second chance, it's not that I've slighted you or killed you,
Sure.
which I can't bring that back. Then it's like, I still want the second chance. Rarely do you see a guy, it's like, yeah, I killed him and I deserve to die, who's not unhealthy.
Yeah.
Like it's hard to find a healthy person, like, yeah, kill me now, I've always wanted to die anyway. Okay, well, that's not healthy, but okay. But for the person that's like, no, I have a really healthy view of life, and I don't even, everybody wants a second chance. That's the point. Yeah. But when I'm not on the receiving end of that, then it feels unjust. And this is the hard thing about judging the justice of God, because this is a situation that we do have more of a bird's eye view. We're hearing what God says. We're kind of getting his perspective on things. But today I don't have a bird's eye view. I have a very concrete view. So if I pull out and somebody hits my car and they drive off, I will immediately think the only justice is me finding that person, them taking responsibility. I don't necessarily need them to go to prison or anything, but I do need them to fix my car, And God might say, no, there's something you need in that car wreck. And I hate that kind of logic. I do. Yeah. But you see it again and again in the Bible.
Well, it reminds me of, and this is like a Tim Keller like thought exercise and something that he really hones in on that's been really helpful for me understanding just forgiveness is when somebody sins, there's almost always like at least two parties that are going to have to be responsible. Like there's the person sinned against and then there's God. And generally speaking, the work of justice, like the anger, the fear, the financial responsibility, that doesn't just go away, right? Like you forgive that person who hits and runs you. There's still the very real cost of fixing the car, the very real cost of like a possible damage that you experience physically. So somebody has to absorb the costs, and somebody has to absorb the damage that was done in one way or the other. And God is constantly on the cross. That's what that is. That's a massive part of what Jesus died on the cross is. This is his part in absorbing all of that damage that we've put out there. But also, like when we think about how we interact day to day, as followers of Jesus, we are also called to love and to sacrifice exactly like Jesus did. And Jesus on the cross is giving himself over and over again to absorb the faults and the sins that we put out into the world. And so what is our duty as followers of Jesus? I think there's a very compelling argument for being like that pain, that loss, that sacrifice has to go somewhere. And most of the time as followers of Jesus, we should be the first ones to be like, hey, I'm going to take that. I'm going to take on that weight myself, which is a dumb thing. I hate it. I mean, it's beautiful. It's beautiful if I see you do it. It's beautiful if I see you be hit and run and you go talk to the person and you pray for them and you go, hey, what, man, my wife and I are doing better financially, and so I'm going to pay for this. And you make sure he's not drunk. You make sure there's just no extenuating circumstances.
Right, yeah.
But he just had a bad day and hit you, and you know what? I don't want you to be in trouble, so I'm just going to pay for this. And whatever. Like that's a conversation you have. I see you do that. That's beautiful and that's amazing and that's incredible. But then you have to go home and how are we going to fit this $4,000 bill into our budget? And then that becomes very ugly and very hideous. Right. And so that I think that's just that constant juggle that we have to do. That when I see it, when I experience that grace, it's incredibly beautiful. When I see you demonstrating that grace, it's incredibly beautiful. When you're actually on the cross hanging with Jesus, it's incredibly painful.
It is. So here's a question that comes out of that for me, and I've got my answer. I'm curious how you would answer it. Why not a payoff pretty immediately? Like when you make the choice, you go out there, you find the guy, I was assuming hit and run, you'll never see him again, but let's go ahead and bring the guy back. He loops back because he feels guilty, whatever. And you make the connection, you free him up, you do not just the right thing, but the incredibly grace-filled thing of taking responsibility for somebody else. You walk back in.
By the way, that's not me saying you as a Christian, you have to absorb the financial debt of that. By the way, I just want to make sure that wasn't what I was saying. Like that can be, maybe that is what God is calling you to, but that is not the concrete 100% rule every time. That's what a Christian should do.
100% right. And we can find examples in the Bible of all of these, these different perspectives on what could Jesus or the Christian have done, and they didn't in the Bible. So we're not just making it up.
And there's an easy scenario you could paint where it would be the unloving thing to do, to not push for the insurance and not have the police. There's many scenarios where that's the case, but just in this one specific scenario.
Yeah, somebody hit me 6 months ago. They paid for my deal, just for the record. Just that's real time. But
Sure. I've had the same thing.
Yeah, it is that interesting. Why do you think God? What's interesting to me right now? Why do you think God doesn't? You come back in here, you're talking to Hannah about it, and you realize, oh my goodness, we have $4,000 in our account that we didn't know we had. Why do you think he doesn't do that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think I have some thoughts around it, but they don't sound like they're as well articulated or as well thought out as yours.
Oh, I really have no opinion. I was counting on you to come through.
You said I have an answer to the question.
I have an answer that will sound oddly like yours.
So genuinely, listener. So genuinely, I paused to think about it for a second, and I was about to cobble together some gobbledygook. It would have been semi well thought out, but it was genuinely. There's so many different facets to answering that question, and so I just want to hear from somebody that probably has a little bit more wisdom on it, like what angle you're coming at it, because I just need help thinking about this.
Yeah. So I think at the base part, and when it happens, it is fantastic. I've had it happen where something extra is being asked of me, and by faith I agree to it. Then I realize, oh wait, God did provide already for that. That has happened. I do think at the end of the day, the unpredictable nature of God, and specifically God's blessings, are needed for me to have faith. If it's very predictable, if I say, God, I need X, and then he gives me X within the time I think is reasonable, which is usually a very, very short time, 24 hours or less kind of thing, then all of a sudden I become God. I start calling the shots, and I start doing things. So the guy hits my car, and I'm like, you know what? God's going to give me $5,000 today. Yeah, here, you can have $5,000. You know what I mean? Because there's no faith in that, because I become certain of let's use this terminology. Instead of being certain of the who, Jesus, God, the Spirit, I become certain of the how. Here's what happened last time. Now it'll happen again. Now it'll happen in the future. So the unpredictability of God is removed, and I slowly stop trusting him.
Mm-hmm. So so this gets into the question of how would Ahab have reacted originally if he knew that ultimately God was going to spare him at the end of this chapter? And you begin to think, like, God is dealing with us on it. Like, again, this is always what we talk about. Like, this whole chapter in my Bible fits onto 2 pages. And we view it from this bird eye view from in between chapter 20 and in between chapter 22. And yet that's not how God is doing it. God is working with us moment by moment. He might know where we're going to end up. He might know where we're going to be. But we all know, like, we need things in the moment that we need them. And it took me I don't know how long have I been married? 6 years. So it took me a good 5 years and 5.5 years to learn in my marriage that there are certain things that Hannah that might be objectively true in terms of like how objectively true in terms of how I deal with my wife, or how I talk to her, or a situation that might come up. But if she is incredibly emotional and incredibly hurt by something, she doesn't need to hear the rational. She doesn't need to there's a step-by-step process to get to whatever my view of what the future is in terms of solving the problem. And we want people to operate on our timeline. We expect God to operate on our time. We expect that God is operating on our timeline. But as followers of Jesus, the much more accurate view is like, hey, we need to realize, one, we need to recognize that God is dealing with us on our timeline while operating on his timeline.
That's right. Yeah. And this is the hard thing, because I wouldn't function like this. Yeah. If I'm God and I've got all the power in the world and I like you in the moment and you do something good, I'm like, oh, you're getting blessed like crazy. Mm-hmm. But then you do something I don't like, and it's like, oh, you're out. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because that's how I deal with so many relationships I have, and that's without any real power, like God has, and without real knowledge. Mm-hmm. So even this conversation, I don't even have the capacity to really discuss it, because I don't know what it's like to know you at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 at the same time. Mm-hmm. And he does. Like, he knows 90-year-old Jason, oh, please, dear Lord, no. But 90-year-old Jason, he knows as intimately as 20-year-old Jason as 52-year-old Jason. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to understand. Yeah. Because he knows what I will need at 60, and I might not realize what I need at 60 till I'm 70. Yeah. And that's the part that I think is so bewildering. That being said, somehow with all that knowledge, he chooses to honor our free will, which every time I have power, I have to work hard not to take away the free will of people.
That's good.
I just have to work really hard at it. And that's the thing. It's like, it's almost impossible for me to even imagine having all the power and honoring your free will.
Yeah.
And leading you so that it's this discovery for you. Not, he knows it. I think when he asks questions of Moses or when he changes his mind with Abraham, he knows exactly how it's going to go. He's letting Abraham exercise his free will because that's the loving thing to do. Now, flip it to me. How many things do I know? And I'm talking to a person who doesn't know. They have less wisdom to me in a certain area, and I have zero patience with them. And I need to step back and say, this is not about Jason. This is about me helping them discover it for themselves. And oftentimes we just say, the answer is 7 + 7, or show more grace, or, whatever it is.
Or Jesus.
Yeah, the answer is Jesus, duh, But it's that idea of saying, oh, that's interesting. And that's what, I've heard pointed out a lot recently of Jesus asked twice as many questions as he answered, and that being a good signal to how I function as a child of God.
No, yeah, that's fantastic. I love that line that this passage has brought out of us. So what was something that specifically stuck out to you?
This just occurred to me. I have 4 things, and I hate this because we're probably almost out of time for everything.
We got good. We got time.
Okay.
Well, that first line went about 17 minutes, so
we
don't have time for 4. But
yeah, exactly.
We have time for a couple.
Maybe this one. So this is the thing that just popped out is, they say there's no honor among thieves kind of deal. It's fascinating, Jezebel's sensitivity to the system and to Ahab. That it says she wrote letters in Ahab's name. So she's not wanting to undercut him, or at least that's the behavior. It's not undercutting him. Whereas she could have, clearly when she threatens Elijah, he catches wind of that very quickly because you don't get the sense he's in the room, So the word spreads quickly, like Jezebel's not going to sleep till you're dead. And he takes that as gospel and runs. So either this is really illustrating Elijah's cowardice, like you're an idiot, or it's showing that when she's not infuriated, because it's not, 400 of her closest people, her yes men died, there on Mount Carmel. So she's enraged. But in her better moments, she's sensitive to Ahab. She has a plan. It's not just this power. It's a power play, but it's subtle. It's smart. It's crafty.
Yeah, and she knows exactly how to manipulate the law. He knows exactly how to.
Right.
She does a lot of this in Ahab's name, in God's name.
Yes.
And so she is so. And I don't mean this in a positive way, but brilliant in terms of how she is manipulating and orchestrating to get what she wants.
I'm going to go ahead and say if she ran for president of the United States, I think she would make a good case that I'd be tempted to give her my vote. Of course, she'd spin it. She didn't kill anybody.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah, she was angry that one time at that guy who caused the death of 400 of her friends, how she'd spin it. But it's like she's crafty. She knows how to get things done. And what it says to me is, but I tend to make things all or nothing. And I think it's fascinating that God would even reveal her sensitivity to Ahab, her intelligence, her awareness of the room, that she was occupying.
Yeah, so she has, not only is she like brilliant, like a brilliant politician, she has deep relational knowledge. She has she is so not just like thinking, and maybe you want to make an argument she's doing all this for Ahab for herself, but ultimately she is still very insanely perceptive and insanely picks up and knows intimately her husband, which again, I think maybe you're getting to, it's so easy to put her in this box of there's so much of who she is that if she were to make a slight turn, man, she would be, could be such a powerful person in the king. If she would just make that slight turn, she has so much going on for her, and so much, and maybe this is ultimately why she doesn't follow Yahweh, doesn't turn to God, is because she's so on top of things. In fact, she seems like a better, in terms of a ruler getting what they want done, she seems better at that than about anybody that I can think of in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's really well said. Solomon would probably be the only one, which is such a fascinating dynamic, at least early on, is I just compared Jezebel to Solomon, but it is something I've never picked up on in reading this, is the fact that she is cold and calculating. But this reminds me of that passage. It's like, how you're no better than anybody if you love the people that love you. She was really good at loving the people that loved her. And what her Achilles was, if you weren't on the inside, you didn't matter at all, you know, and you would do whatever. There was no justice in that sense because you would just take what you wanted. But she was clever, and it's a weird twist. I hadn't expected to go that way, but it's fascinating to me how we know people that are really good in certain aspects of their life, but they just don't love God. And it's challenging. It's challenging because it's not an illegitimate claim to say, wait a minute, I know people are not Christians. It's challenging because there is that dynamic of it's a legitimate claim to say, I know people who aren't Christians that are so much better than Christians. Now, that may mean that person knows God outside of organized religion, or it may mean that they are really good in their lanes.
Yeah. Well, I think even, this Jezebel has been used as a pejorative term to, talk about women that have anything to say in the church. It's been a label thrown at them. I think oftentimes if we were to look at the church, the people who would be most correctly identified as a Jezebel would be probably preachers, people who are able to love and to work with the small group of people that they love and that they've chosen to the exclusion of all others, to ability to manipulate, to grow, to shift, to change, to get the outcome they want for their people, and not really being worried about anybody outside of their doors, or anybody that chooses to go outside their doors. And so I just want to say, because again, I feel some energy around this as just a regular dude, and I imagine there's probably a lot more energy around if you're a female and you're listening. I'm sure there's a different energy for you hearing us talk about Jezebel, but I just want to get out there. I think probably the label fits a lot more men than it's fit women in the history of the church.
Yeah, I think I knew I needed a shirt that said, please give me grace, I'm working on being an ex-Pharisee, but now I'm adding to the label, I'm on an ex-Pharisee and an ex-Jezebel, because I think you're right. I think there is something about the temptation when you're a minister or a church leader of any kind to say, okay, we've got our people and let's tighten it up and make sure nobody leaves and shut that back door and these kind of things that are terminology. And then it becomes this really ugly controlling thing. And I'm tempted, when somebody comes to me and says, hey, we're going to go on to this other church, and I'm like, okay. And I want so badly to be kingdom over congregation, but my heart hurts, and so the devil says, hey, you have the right to look what all I did to you, or whatever it is.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think about, I've known ministers who, moved heaven and earth for their people, something like that, had deep relational knowledge, were smart, were cunning and wise when it came to the growth, what they saw as the growth of their people, as the growth of their organization. And I, even for me, when we got fired from our church, a lot of the hard parts for us when we left were we're recognizing how many of the good things that some of the people there did, while also holding to the fact of a lot of the really evil and abusive things that were done to us and done to other people. It's always, again, this. I don't want to make it seem like, oh, everybody does equally bad and everyone does equally good, and this is all that it is. But I think it is important to recognize that the love of God is not insular. The love of God is something that transcends the walls of a church. It transcends what you would define as your group of people. Now, again, it might just look like working with your people, but if your love for your people comes from God, then it by necessity is going to go beyond your circle of people.
I think that is gold. I really appreciate you framing it the way you have. That gives me, this is what this is supposed to be like for me. I want to walk away not feeling like, hey, I did good talking there. You know what I mean? I want to walk away being more amazed and more perplexed, because when you're more perplexed, even though that's not how we're framing this particular discussion, I think it's so invaluable to my heart because it gets me to asking the right questions. And I think that's a good question for me to ask is, hey, is my love for God limited to the people that are my people? And in our culture, that's a really popular, who are your people? Find your people, and I get why. But as a Christian, find your people and then work on loving all people, get whatever strength you need from others. But immediately turn that outward. I think it's super important for me, today thinking about this.
So as we finish up here, what is one last thing that you that really stuck out to you?
One thing that you've said in the past is thinking about Ahab as a man, and how he's really normal. That's how it hits me. He's just really normal. He's got a lot of self-doubt, and in many ways, every spiritually unhealthy man I know is Ahab, including me when I'm spiritually unhealthy. It's like, as long as everything's going good, I'm looking good, I'm sounding good, then my wife needs to rescue me, which is unhealthy. It's not your wife coming alongside you or your husband coming alongside you. That's fantastic and how God designed it. But when you say, in place of God, I want some other person to rescue me, that's not their job. They're not even capable fully of doing that, and she couldn't rescue him from himself. She can give him what he wanted in the moment, but that's not what he needed ultimately.
Yeah.
And I just wonder about their marital relationship. Like, what is she thinking when he's out there in sackcloth and ashes? Like, are they so disconnected she doesn't know? Mm-hmm. Or is she, because basically from her perspective, it's like, okay, I did all this stuff for you. You get what you want. This lunatic who I vowed to kill but never got around to it comes up, says a few words to you, and now you're ripping your clothes. And those are wealthy clothes, I assume.
Yeah.
And everybody's seeing this, or is he doing it privately? I'm just like, is she just rolling her eyes and going, of course you are. In a sitcom, you could see Jezebel and Ahab, that kind of thing, where she's like the typical stupid husband kind of thing. So it's interesting how in all of this big stuff that's happening around Ahab and this whole scenario, how common it is.
And that this whole thing, that the ultimate death of a man and then the rebuke of God, it all starts just because he's like covetous. Like it's such a small thing. And I think it's a great example of so much of the time, I'm speaking for myself, like the small sins that we indulge of, like a little covetousness here, a little lustfulness here, a little whatever it would be, a little pride there. You think, oh, well, what's the big deal? I really would love that vineyard. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I'm really sad that I don't get to have that anymore. And it just shows the consequences of of what those small things can become. And maybe that is a lot of what this story is trying to tell, of like when we allow those, what we would consider small sins, to gain such a purchase into our hearts, the utter destruction that it can wreak. And ultimately, like I would, again, like getting into ranking sins, I don't know. I consider murder to be pretty bad. I consider it to be especially bad.
It's called a high impact sin. It's much better to think about killing someone than killing them.
Yeah. So, anyways, his quote unquote smaller sin, so to speak, he doesn't even go on to do anything else, but that his like giving way to that desire, that leading, ultimately leads to the sin of his wife and the murder of a man, and it just goes down this whole path. And I think it's just I think it's just a really good reminder to recognize, like, we think when we sin, what we would consider a small sin, that we have control over that sin, but we have no idea how that impacts other people. Mm-hmm. And even for people that think they're doing even for people who think they're doing good, like Jezebel does. Oh, I'm taking care of my husband. I'm making my husband feel better.
Yeah.
In his sullenness and his sulking, I'm going to make him feel better. And ultimately, like, the sin is just going to expound, and it's going to wreak havoc and cause so many troubles. And I think that's just a really important one of this. I mean, there's a dozen other things we could have talked about in this chapter, but I think that's just one last important thing to draw out.
I think it's exceptionally true, and I think it also illustrates that dynamic of, I think in our lives a lot of times we're like, I'm one blessing away from being happy. If I can just have this one thing, finish this one accomplishment, or get this one thing. And he could have easily gone about 100 vineyards. I'm certain he has the wealth of the nation at his disposal. But it's just that age-old dynamic of, once I start saying, once I get this, I'm happy, I've got to step back, do some soul searching, because if I'm not careful, one of my sins will start to move me in that direction. I'll try to think of these pseudo ways, these faux ways of moving in that direction, instead of stepping back, saying, God, this is something I want, and letting him teach me and lead me, either to say, hey, you don't need that, or, yeah, we can get that, but we're going to do it in this other way. And I think that's really important, is, do you love the blessing more than the blesser? And I just think it's a fascinating turnaround. I wish it lasted for Ahab, but it's a fascinating turnaround for this very common man.
Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Grace, peace, and love.